From tragedy to history being made, from our very beginnings, we've made a commitment to cover the highs and the lows, to document everyday life here on Delmarva. From covering breaking news to uncovering horrors.
We know he's the one who did it, and he's going to pay the price.
It's a responsibility we don't take lightly.
We're outside of arson fire number 66, the Whispering Pines Motel.
Shifting gears, everybody, live coverage here of the Antares rocket getting off the launch pad and then bursting into flames.
An honor we don't take for granted.
Sergeant Stephen Floyd was with the department for 16 years.
From the ocean to the Chesapeake and the areas in between.
WBOC got a call this morning, so we flew Chopper 16 over a farm in Hebron.
For 65 years, we've kept you informed and shared your stories. 65 years of being Delmarva's news leader.
Yeah, 65 years ago today, WBOC News made its first appearance in living rooms across Delmarva, becoming the first television station on the peninsula. Since then, our platform has grown, letting you now get your news on any screen, wherever you are.
Whether celebrating success or reporting on tragedy, we have spent the last 6.5 decades covering the stories that matter to you most. And for the next 30 minutes, we will take a trip back to 1954 and the world that was at a time when WBOC TV was born.
When folks on Delmarva tuned their televisions to WBOC TV for the first time on July 15, 1954, the first image that was seen on TV screens across Delmarva was this, a test pattern. And then at 7:15 p.m., that pattern was gone and John B. Greenberger would begin to deliver the news into homes on the peninsula. The next day, there was a small blurb in the Salisbury Times with a quote from Charles J. Truitt, the general manager of the station, who called the first broadcast, quote, smooth and no trouble. And it would be a busy start for the news operation at WBOC as the next day a Chestertown fireworks and munitions plant was destroyed by a series of explosions that lasted for 90 minutes. 10 people died in that incident. But the early days of WBOC were much more than news. WBOC became a social hub on Delmarva as the station hosted live variety shows, game shows, talent contests, beauty contests, and hours of live in-studio educational programs. And in its early days, with the Delmarva Peninsula seen as an attractive market to national networks, WBOC aired programming from ABC, NBC, and CBS before becoming a full-time CBS affiliate. WBOC was the first television station on Delmarva and remains a powerhouse in broadcasting 65 years later. Just 4 days after the start of WBOC TV was the start of a powerhouse musician's career. The first single by Elvis Presley was released called That's All Right.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, Mama. Just any way you do it, that's all right.
Speaking of music, the top song of 1954 was Little Things Mean a Lot by Kitty Callan.
A line a day when you're far away. Little things mean a lot.
For everyone driving the streets of Delmarva in their 54 Buick Skylarks, they could fill up at the pump for just 21 cents a gallon. Our president in 1954, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in June of 1954 made a stop in Dover, can be seen here meeting with Delaware Governor J. Caleb Boggs. And 1954 was just the beginning of color TVs, with RCA rolling out its first color model, the CT100, costing about $1,000. In 65 years, music has changed, so have TVs. Gas prices have gone up and cars have become more futuristic. But there has been one constant here on Delmarva, and that is WBOC.
It was that same year the Milford 11 tried to help break down racial barriers in Delaware schools. A few years ago, we aired a special called Desegregating Delaware, which highlighted their story. Now we once again want to highlight those students. Here's Kimberly Wiggins.
It was Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 that quite literally opened the door for African American students. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down this separate but equal doctrine, and for the first time in Delaware history, black students can attend white schools. Downstate, the small town of Milford becomes a pilot program for integration. In 1954, there were more than 5,000 people living in Milford, and census data estimates 16% were African Americans. The school board quickly and quietly assigned 11 African American students to Milford High School, including Orlando Camp.
We were excited about that because what it meant is that for the first time we would get an equal education in terms of what the white kids were going through.
However, it only took a few days for crowds of protesters to begin to surround the school. But Camp and the others were determined.
We're going to win this one. We're going to fight this one. We're going to do our best to get this education that's given to us for the first time in history.
But things would only get more difficult for the Milford 11 as Bryant Bowles, a man from Baltimore who started the National Association for the Advancement of White People, came to town in September, holding a rally in Kent County, urging people to keep their kids home from school until the school stopped the integration effort.
Let them go their way and leave us alone, and we will go our way and never bother them. The National Association for Advancement of White People, the people out there have asked me to announce that they are in favor if any Negro walks into any school anywhere in Delaware Monday, that to have a statewide walkout in the school.
The protesters and threats would become too much, and the integration effort would have to end. And while Camp and the 10 others would not be welcomed into Milford High School in the mid-50s, nearly 60 years later, they were all given honorary degrees during a presentation in 2012 at the school's commencement ceremony. And Camp says he and the others in the Milford 11 have an appreciation for what they did 65 years ago.
Many students come up to me and say, thank you. Thank you for what you went through. You made it possible for me to feel good about what I'm doing in terms of education. And black and white students, and I feel proud about that.
65 years ago, 11 students in Milford made waves across Delmarva and across the country and helped break down barriers for generations to come. Kimberly Wiggins, WBOC News.
Delmarva has long been home to a thriving seafood industry. Chris Weimer shows us how things have changed, for better or worse, since 1954.
On a late winter afternoon, the crew of the Thunder Bay is icing down the boat, preparing it for a few days-long trip out into the Atlantic for the Martin Seafood Company in Ocean City. They're hoping to bring back 15,000 to 20,000 pounds of fish. The marina in West Ocean City is pretty quiet, but it's still not like how things were. 65 years ago, Dave Martin was 12 years old. He would eventually become the owner of the Martin Seafood Company, but in '54, he says things were different here in West Ocean City at the marina.
Well, there was probably a lot of boats in if the weather was bad from Virginia, North Carolina, New Jersey, so not to get out of the weather. And they'd be packing fish, obviously, because they want to unload and re-ice and go when the weather got better. So it was activity in here back then, in those days.
Martin says there were more boats and more fishing companies. Generally, just more activity. He says these days it's a lot harder to make a living commercial fishing in Ocean City. At the Ocean City Life Saving Museum, there's an exhibit dedicated to the fishing past of the now resort town. Sandy Hurley is the curator of the museum.
In the 50s, one of the biggest industries would have been the surf clam industry. That started in the late 40s, early 50s, and a lot of the surf clams that were used for clam strips, like at Howard Johnson's or Mrs. Paul's Seafood or that kind of thing, came from offshore here.
But Hurley says over time, sport fishing became more popular in Ocean City, and the space around the harbor, once filled with seafood houses and companies, has transitioned to restaurants and housing. From the ocean to the Chesapeake Bay, seafood is a way of life in Crisfield, always has been, probably always will be. But things were certainly more robust in the seafood capital of the world back in 1954, according to former mayor and local historian Kim Lawson.
In 1950, in the city of Crisfield, there were 27 crab picking plants that pick crab meat. Of those, 15 were oyster packing plants, so they did 2 different seafoods around the calendar. Today we only have 2 crab picking plants, and one of them is really quite part-time.
Lawson says over the past 65 years, the way people want seafood and what they're willing to pay for it has changed, which has caused a lot to change in Crisfield. For Ocean City, it was an easy switch from a seafood community to tourism. In Crisfield, the tourism aspects are there, just for more of a niche outdoor market. The city is evolving, and while seafood like oysters and crabs remain the backbone, change was inevitable over 65 years.
In 1954, around the waterfront of the city of Crisfield, every crab picking plant had a steam. They produced crabs by steaming them. Therefore, they had a steam whistle. And in the infancy of lower middle class people who worked picking crabs, they didn't have a home telephone. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they would listen for around the waterfront, the whistles of those those houses telling them, we have crabs to pick tomorrow morning, report to work at 6 o'clock. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there would be a hush kind of over the community, and you would hear, we've got crabs tomorrow, come and pick.
I'm Chris Weimer, WBOC News.
And of course, agriculture was, is, and probably always will be the lifeblood of Delmarva. As Charles Paparella shows us, the way things are done on the farm has come a long way.
At the Delaware Agriculture Museum in Dover, there are agricultural relics from almost 2 centuries ago, and some from the not-so-distant past. They look like they could still be used on a farm today. In the grand scheme of things, 65 years isn't that long, but just by looking at some of this equipment, you can get an idea of how far things have come and see some things that we will never see used again. The executive director of the Ag Museum, Carolyn Claypool, tells us that the 1950s were an emerging time for poultry in Delaware and on Delmarva. The Delmarva Poultry Exchange began in 1952. Claypool says farms in the 50s were filled with peas and tomatoes and lima beans and corn. Beef cattle and dairy herds were a common sight on local farms, including the farm Jim Truitt grew up on and still works to this day. At 77, Truitt was a young teenager in 1954 and using this tractor that still sits on his farm. It's a far cry from what he now uses and what technology can accomplish versus 65 years ago.
You really couldn't even compare the work involved. And of course, we were planting with like a 4-row planter, and now they've got probably 12, 16, I don't know where they go, how much bigger.
Truitt said the hard work hasn't changed, just evolved over 65 years with time and technology. The crops still need to be tended to and the animals cared for. But there's one piece of farm life he remembers from his youth that won't be making a comeback. That was how they sold milk for cash between harvests.
You put it in a cooler that had water in it, and I don't know what the temperature was, but that's how you cooled the milk down. Then the next morning, you put the cans out along the road, then there was a guy that come picked it up.
65 years has brought some changes in technology and practice, but the hard work that goes into farming, let's just say it stood the test of time. Charles Paparella, WBOC News.
Coming up, we continue to go back in time. Dan Satterfield is going to deliver today's forecast just like it was done back when WBOC first began. You don't want to miss it.
But first, did you know that 1954 wasn't only the start of WBOC, it was also the first year the Orioles baseball franchise came to Baltimore. Before that, the team was known as the St. Louis Browns.
Welcome back to Black and White TV on July 15th, 1954. It's Thursday, and you don't have to wait to see the newspaper to get your morning weather map anymore. We're going to give it to you every day on our weather segment here on the new WBOC TV 16. And let's start with the almanac data. The high at the airport today, only 82 because a thunderstorm moved in right around midday. Dropped about 3/600ths of an inch of rain. Over in Georgetown, though, our observer reported a low of 69, a high of 90, and he had a pretty good afternoon soaking, a pretty good thunderstorm 1.33 inches of rain. You know, it's that time of the year when we get these afternoon storms, and if you get under one, you can get a lot of rain, while just down the street, your farmer friend doesn't get any. In Cambridge, 1.37 inches of rain today, so a pretty good thunderstorm there as well, even heavier than Georgetown with a high of 91. So let's go to the weather maps. This is the weather map for 2019, July 15th. And here's what's going on. We have a weak high pressure up over upstate New York. A front came through Sunday evening and pushed down to the south. It's now stalled right around Norfolk. To the north of that front, we are getting now a light northeast wind today, and that's actually making it slightly more comfortable than it has been. Boston's at 85 degrees. To the south of this front, though, it is hot and muggy around the Bermuda High in the south. 84 in New Orleans. Of course, they've had a lot of rain down there. What's left of Barry is now over northern Arkansas. Now, here's the thing. We think the Bermuda High is going to steer Barry right up to Pennsylvania later this week as this front dissipates. So we may get some rain and thunder from it on Thursday. And we want that because there's some real heat on the way. I mean, the hottest weather of the summer. We might get a break of a thunderstorm on Thursday, but outside of that, the Bermuda High is going to bring in temperatures by the weekend, we think, maybe in the upper 90s, but that's extremely long range. By the way, it's fairly quiet out west, 105 in Phoenix and Seattle, typical for this time of the year, at around 68 Los Angeles Airport on the hour this afternoon. Yes, we can get the weather from all the way out there. It's 70 degrees. Let me give you the forecast here. I'll put the board up here from the Weather Bureau. For tonight, clear skies, a low of 71. And then Tuesday, hot and sticky, will hit 94 degrees. And Wednesday, the extended forecast, as far as we can see today, we now think it's going to be even hotter, 97 degrees. That is really hot weather for here on Delmarva, even in July. And that's your weather segment.
Coming up next, we'll see how the Salisbury Zoo has grown and changed over 6.5 decades.
But before that, another 1954 fun fact. Salisbury University, which at the time was called Maryland State Teachers College, reached its then highest enrollment with 400 students. Today, SU is home to more than 8,700 undergraduate and graduate students.
As we continue to celebrate our 65th anniversary here at WBOC TV, we visit another place that also got its start in 1954, the Salisbury Zoo. Here's Bill Mitch.
In the Salisbury Zoo's newest exhibit are some of its newest inhabitants. These wallaby joeys in their mother's pouch are getting plenty of attention these days. And of course, Pinocchio and Chaska is still getting tons of people coming by to say hi. The zoo, the animals, and the care provided for them has come a long way in 65 years. But the story of the zoo actually starts a bit earlier, back when all of this land in the zoo and city park was actually a lake. And after the dam broke, the city decided this land would serve as a park, a service to the community.
As part of that, people began bringing in orphaned wildlife. The legend is that the first animal that came here was a white-tailed deer fawn and was taken care of. But it really began as a grassroots effort.
Families in the area wanted their kids to be able to see the wildlife, and the city of Salisbury was committed to making that happen safely. In 1954, the zoo became official, and the first zookeeper was hired. Over the next few decades, the Zoo Commission would be established, and the first zoo director was brought on as well. In its infancy, not only was the zoo much smaller, but there were some very different animals on site as well.
In the early days, we had an elephant from Thailand, a youngster. And part of the growing path of both this zoo and other zoos is figuring out what's appropriate. And we don't have the space to manage an elephant, certainly don't have the space to manage an elephant herd, which is the appropriate way to keep them. And so we moved on to other animals.
Between 1954 and 2019, plenty has changed. The zoo has grown, the care for the animals vastly improved, and these days the zoo is heavily focused on broad conservation issues and efforts, highlighted by Pinocchio in his journey from Ecuador. But over those 65 years, there remains at least one constant.
This zoo began as a desire on the part of community residents, families, to be able to let their children see wildlife in the native habitat. And that's the same thing we're trying to do today. Be a resource to the community, free, accessible, where children, other members of the community can come and see and enjoy wildlife in a natural setting.
Nicknamed the best little zoo in North America, the Salisbury Zoo has been going strong now for 65 years, just like WBOC. And Chaska and Pinocchio, along with all the other animals, are looking forward to many more visitors for decades to come. In Salisbury, I'm Bill Mitch, WBOC News.
And from poodle skirts and ponytails to saddle shoes and pleats, Jacqueline Carley has a look at how fashion has evolved since the mid-1950s.
A trip down the main hallway at WBOC is a trip through time. Here is the beginning of the station, 1954, and the few pictures on the wall give us a glimpse into the fashion world of the mid-50s. But fortunately, there is a new exhibit in Princess Anne that gives us much more than a glimpse. Inside the Teakle Mansion is the exhibit called Fashionable Revolution, showing off styles from the 19th and 20th centuries, including the 1950s. And what's nice about this particular outfit is that it belonged to the woman who helped put the exhibit together, Sally Ridgway.
I think the big thing was that everybody wanted to be fashionable, especially when you went to church. You know, you want to make sure you had your hat and your gloves and your little purse or whatever. So it just was a very in thing for everyone.
Girls often found in poodle skirts, bobby socks, saddle shoes, and ponytails. Sally says this outfit she wore in the mid-50s in the 7th grade. Her mother actually made it for her, something not uncommon for moms to do 65 years ago. And Ridgway also has her older sister's dress from the same time period in the exhibit as well.
If you note, it's pleated, the whole dress is pleated. And that takes a lot of extra time. And of course, every pleat is exactly the same dimension. And so it just, that made it extra beautiful, that's for sure.
Ridgway described the fashion as a little bit glamorous during the mid-50s. World War II was over and people had a little more money to spend on clothing. And fashion was becoming a big piece of everyday lives as WBOC came on the air. Jacqueline Carley, WBOC News.
Still ahead, a glimpse into the future of our company.
But first, did you know in 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed the Constitution be amended to give 18-year-olds the right to vote. However, the 26th Amendment wasn't ratified until 1971 under then-President Richard Nixon.
We have shown you Draper Media's past. Now, on to the future, a multi-platform expansion that officially broke ground today.
Madeline Overturf and Matt Penzick show us how the Draper Media legacy is finding new life at WRDE.
Later this year, this Milton parking lot will be a 600-square-foot lobby adorned with artifacts and a timeline of longtime WBOC owner Tom Draper's life. The building dedicated as the Thomas H. Draper Media Center.
Essentially, with the acquisition of WRDE and bringing in Telemundo over here and the various support personnel that's needed to make a live broadcast here right in Milton, we're going to have a very busy team over here.
Along with the lobby, plans to launch the new WRDE, the first local newscast based in Delaware.
It's the greatest day of my life. I started WRDE in an 8x10 wooden garden shed. Now compare that to the plans you've seen for WRDE today.
Tom Draper's hard hat from the 2008 WBOC Newsplex expansion in Salisbury was on hand in Milton, a piece of the past honoring our company's future.
Tom always wanted to do that. Let's keep looking forward. Let's expand, but let's do it right. And I know Tom's looking down today with tears in his eyes, I'm sure.
As we celebrate 65 years, we look ahead to the next 65.
Things are growing. That's what we want to do. We want to grow. We want to be here for the people of Delmarva and serve them and just keep everybody informed.
This is a big step for RDE and the entire Draper Media family.
And we are so honored to have all of you as viewers and all of you along for this ride. With coverage you can count on, I'm Maddie Overturf.
And I'm Matt Pensick in Milton for WBOC.
And we look forward to serving you and sharing your stories for another 65 years. Have a good night, everybody.